This is the first of a series of interviews that we're doing in partnership with Intuit QuickBooks. And today I have the pleasure of joining me with Giuseppe Guillot. First question, I'd really like people to understand your story. How did you get into the world of baking and bakery? Tell us your story and about your business.
I spent about 20 years in digital, working for global companies of the tenure of Hughes Net-a-Porter, or more recently Kurt Geiger, which is a UK brand. And out of random contacts during lockdown, we got into contact with this great baker down in Italy who approached baking bread from an artisanal standpoint. So making sure that he was using high quality grains, making sure he was not using artificial leavens, but only natural and sourdough starters, and therefore ensuring the correct way of doing bread, and coupled with the technology of blast freezing that enabled him effectively to produce a product specifically in the south of Italy using grains from a region called Altamura, which are durum wheat grains, so not genetically modified like most soft wheats are across the globe, and the ability of baking and fast freezing them so that he could effectively distribute them globally and maintaining that quality without losing the fragrance, but also the nutritional factors. So baking is typically a non-scalable business, or at least has a lot of difficulty in scaling because you have to do a lot of planning, ensuring that the leavening is adequate in terms of time. So the moment they introduce blast freezing, and therefore, which is an industrial process, but you couple it to an artisanal process, then effectively you have something that is unique on the market. And I brought it in the UK, and I specialized in the distribution of this product to high-end restaurants and clubs, primarily in London. So I service about 40, 50 of these high-end restaurants and clubs, who obviously appreciate the fact that they have a product that can be kept in a freezer, but also on a fridge, and can be used as needed, will require only a few minutes of baking once defrosted. So even from a customer restaurant standpoint, they did not need to do that planning of ordering bread that then would have been going to waste, because they would just bake on demand based on the daily requirements that they would see in the restaurants or club. So that's how the business started. We now import about a truckload every month, every 2 months. And my clients, as I said, are restaurants and private clubs.
And because you bring these products from Italy and your customers are in the UK, I know when we spoke earlier, you talked about the unique problems from a cash flow perspective that brings you. Can you explain to people who haven't been a baker or in this position the role that cash flow and cash plays in your business?
Obviously, the moment that I'm importing a full truckload, which is an investment of about £25,000, and it's an investment that I also have to pay within days, because the supplier in Italy doesn't provide me the necessary credit because of size, or because of trust, or because of complexity in case of non-payment. And therefore, I end up paying a product basically on delivery. And that truckload, it takes me a month and a half to sell. And then I've got payment terms that range from 30 to 60 days. So effectively, I'm dispersing an amount of cash, which I'm recuperating within the next 3 to 4 months, assuming that I'm selling 100% to a truckload. Now, luckily, it's a product that lasts about a year, so I don't incur waste. But effectively, I'm in a cash draining business, whereby the more I grow, the more I need to anticipate cash that will be repaid within months. So that's a bit the situation of my business. Now, luckily, I take into account this factor, and it's funded to support it. But effectively, if this were to grow, this could be a significant problem.
And of course, if customers then pay late beyond their terms, it's a double problem. So I'm guessing that at some point in your history, you've experienced problems with late payment. And I just wondered if you could share a story of how it affected the business and what happened.
Well, the problem with late payments effectively is that they're actually very, very often. In other words, there are very few the customers that pay within their agreed upon time. So you end up dispersing a lot of time and energy on terms of following up and then ensuring that the payments are made, or putting yourself in a situation of denying delivery in order to put a bit of leverage to try to get paid. So there were a lot of small stories, luckily nothing particularly onerous that affected my business, but I end up effectively spending most of my time chasing payments, chasing customers, instead of maybe promoting the product or looking for new customers. So the time that I'm dedicating to chasing payments and validating that they are effectively late, or providing the information that is needed in order to request that payment, is a burden. In other words, the time I'm taking is excessive. So luckily, again, there wasn't an issue, because again, there are a lot of clients. Maybe the amounts of money are not enormous compared to the investment made when you're buying a truckload, but it sums up, and the bottom line is the time.
And when you have had experience of, let's say, good customers who pay fast, on time, regularly, again, what difference does it make in terms of what you can do with your business?
But it helps, because at least I have guaranteed cash flow, or at least predictability of those payments that then will be used to pay employees versus rent versus the customer or the supplier back in Italy, which effectively there are these lump sums that have to be dispersed, and without going and getting credit or getting loans. That certainty provides also certainty on my ability to fulfill my obligations, especially because I got employees, landlords, suppliers, and other minor aspects. So when the ball starts slipping, there is a bit of an effect, which then drops and affects everybody else down the chain. And typically it affects the weaker elements versus the stronger that have the ability of subsidizing or navigating a delay. So it's just a problem that it's a bit of an unnecessary problem you have to deal with, and it's just draining in terms of times and resources.
Mm, mm. Now, when we talked earlier on, I know we talked about the role of government and what government could do to help small businesses with this, tackle this problem, and you had some interesting ideas. I wondered if you could share those ideas of what you think government should be doing to help.
Yeah, in other words, knowing the limitations, obviously, of government, and seeing also what has happened in other circumstances. When I have invoices on customers that are typically good customers that have good credit and have significantly better, stronger balance sheet than myself, effectively a delay in payment is primarily a timing issues, and there are financial institutions that support businesses and provide the ability of anticipating these payments through what is called factoring. The problem of factoring is the ability of getting the necessary approvals in the financial institutions in order to be provided with that access, and the cost of that access to that kind of financing. So when you start adding it up, it might become something that small businesses have actually difficulty in having access to. And at that point, the role of the government could be a role of, let's say, guarantor. In other words, it can be a role whereby they facilitate a specific program of factoring by providing the necessary backing to financial institutions in order not to elevate that element of risk, which otherwise would translate in an element of cost, because financial institutions obviously apply the cost of debt or the cost of interest to the element of risk. If they were in a risk-free environment, they would apply a 5%, which is the Bank of England rate on the funds. But by definition, companies have higher elements of risk, and therefore they start applying higher costs. Now, if the government were to intervene with a special program designed for small businesses, maybe they could just provide a guarantee to the financial institution in order for them to make the reasonable amount of earnings, but at a reduced level of risk. And therefore, if I were to be provided with an option of factoring my payments at a cost, which is pretty much what could be a credit card cost on a transaction, a 1%, maybe something a bit higher, something a bit lower, then at that point, I could have the choice of using that instrument and gaining access to capital, which otherwise it would be very difficult for me to do. So the complexity of a project like this is obviously determining the scope of who gets maybe the credit or who gets which small businesses can access, depending also on some parameters which might be tied to the suppliers that they have or how their revenues are distributed. But in many ways, these are things that effectively can be provided, they can be piloted, and bottom line, it's something that the government would not pay anything for unless there are significant elements of non-payment. But they would provide a base for streamlining financing to small businesses in a very cost-effective way.
Yes, and it's very interesting that a lot of the data is already out there on the history of payments and invoicing and what have you. We, like you, are users of QuickBooks to do our accounting, for example. Kind of tools here hold a lot of information on the financial history of a company, so anybody wanting to check can presumably do so using things like that.
Exactly. And that could be something that is a very cost-effective way, because you're not proposing funds from the government, which obviously it's definitely harder to do, but you're asking the government based on information that is available and can be analyzed. In other words, it doesn't have to be open to every single small business in the country. But because of QuickBooks' ability to have detailed information of many customers, they can effectively screen or provide a base for which, if you respect certain financial criteria, you might have access to a pilot program, which over time the government can start sponsoring with certain financial institutions that are willing to do it, and can continue to grow it or interrupt it based on effective returns or risks that the financial institutions are getting if those payments are not made on the invoices.
Well, I think that's fascinating. And as I mentioned to you, people that work in these organizations will be watching these things. And I'm very much a believer in partnership in terms of solving this problem. It can't be solved by any one entity.
Correct.
Well,
and the key is you try to do it in a way that you're not necessarily changing how businesses operate. So my clients, often they are larger companies that maybe are running 20, 30 restaurants. Now they have procurement departments, they have processes, they take payment terms of 30 days, 60 days, not only because of trying to improve their cash flow, but sometimes their effective times to process and get the necessary approvals to make those payments. And trying to compress that time is definitely a challenge. So if you just find a way of letting them operate and ensuring that they just pay on time, that can be something that, again, can be monitored and can be overseen. At that point, you're creating a mechanism by the financial institution. They can obviously earn a return on the monies that they're lending, possibly a rate of return which is comparable to a level of risk that in that case will be very low because of the word provided by government that they would in some way act as guarantors. A bit like it happens with student loans or other aspects that effectively facilitate access to capital without necessarily requiring any direct investment from the government.
Well, Giuseppe, it's fascinating to hear your story and your ideas. I can tell you've worked in both large businesses and small by the way you've thought this through. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us today.
You're very welcome.